Hello, my name is Scott Biegen, and I'm a librarian at the Palm Springs Public Library. And welcome to Job Searching in the Time of Quarantine, Part 1, Resumes, Cover Letters, and Applications. Let's get started. So, what am I covering here today? Well, I'll start with talking about our current situation with the coronavirus. Obviously, lots of things have changed. And then I'll talk about where you should get guidance and advice from and who you should be getting guidance and advice from. There's a lot of bad advice out there. A lot of bad advice. So it's really important you're getting your guidance from a good place. And I'll also talk about what you should do before you start applying for jobs. And I'll also talk about some things that you shouldn't do, as in how to identify some of that bad advice out there. Because, like I said, there's an awful lot of bad advice out there. Then we'll talk about actually applying for jobs. So we'll talk about online job applications and focus on resumes, cover letters, and references. And then I'll talk about what should you do if you haven't gotten any interviews and you've been applying for months. Now, I can't cover everything here today, so we're going to do a part 2 of this in January. So on January 7th next year, we will be going and putting this on YouTube, and you can watch that obviously on demand, and we'll also put it live on Facebook at 2 p.m. That's January 7th, so mark your calendars. And in part 2, I'll go over interviews, how to prepare for interviews, and we're going to focus on virtual interviews too, and phone interviews, because that's primarily how you'll be interviewing for positions these days. And then we'll also talk about what you ought to do if you've had interviews, maybe like 4 or 5 interviews, and you just haven't gotten any job offers. Alright, I assume if you're watching this here today that you're looking for a new job, and I think it's also safe to say that if you're watching this and you're unemployed, it's due to the coronavirus. It's due to our scary little friend down there at the bottom. Don't worry, he's not coming back. He's going to go away after this and you won't see him again. But obviously, and I don't have to tell you this, things have changed. I retired this presentation in spring of 2019, and I hoped I would never have to bring it back, but I realized even at the time I probably would. I never thought I'd be bringing it back due to a pandemic, though. And I think all of this caught everyone off guard, but it also caught human resources departments and employers off guard as well. Things changed overnight. So I will talk about these changes. Honestly, a lot of this is going to be similar to the presentation as it was given before, just simply because the trend was moving towards a more online environment to do the job search and the application. But I will talk to you about how things have changed. One thing that hasn't changed is you do need to look at yourself critically. And you need to do that before you even start looking for a job. You need to know your KSAs. KSAs, those are your knowledge, skills, and abilities. Those are the things that you know how to do, and you can show that you know how to do them. So that could be through a diploma or a certificate, a degree. It could be through a skill that you know how to do, like speaking a foreign language. You need to really think about what it is that you know how to do and what your strengths are, and also what your weaknesses are, because you need to sell yourself. You want to sell yourself. And if you don't know what your knowledge, skills, and abilities are, how can you communicate those to a prospective employer? So I highly encourage you to sit down and brainstorm. Think about all the things, all the wonderful things that you know how to do. And if you notice that there are some gaps, this might be a perfect time to fill some of those gaps by going back to school or getting more training. I also want to stress to you that you ought to be realistic. And that doesn't just apply to how long it might take for you to find a new job, but also about the time that you have. Sometimes people want to apply to everything that they see, and that's not a good strategy when you're looking for a new job. It's better to look for jobs that make sense, that are the next logical step in your career, and focus on just 1 or 2 jobs per week, and then craft customized cover letters and resumes and applications towards those jobs. And if you're doing that well, there isn't really a way to do 3, 4, or 5 applications a week. Maybe 3, but definitely not 5 or 6. Okay? So don't try to apply to everything out there. And as I said, it's going to take some time. It could take a year or more for you to get a new job. And success in any type of situation could be just hearing back from 10% of the places that you apply. If you get that type of feedback, you're doing really well. And the honest truth is, most of these applications aren't going to lead to anything. You're just going to gain experience with applying, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. The more you do this, the better you will get at it. But the thing is, you don't want to get hung up on any application here. You want to move on mentally after each submission, because a lot could happen. Maybe the job gets canceled, a budget gets cut, someone in HR goes on vacation, or hopefully they don't get sick, but that could be the case as well. So don't focus too much on any of these jobs you've applied to. Keep plugging away at it, and one day it will happen. Okay, so historically there have been some situations with a job search that have been a bit more challenging, and one of those has been being unemployed. I don't think that's right. If you're unemployed, especially right now due to the pandemic, that's not your fault. And I'm truly sorry if that's the case. But in the past, it has been easier to find a job if you currently have one. So if you have a job, hang on to it. If you don't have one, try to keep busy through volunteering or finding some kind of work or learning new skills. As for the other situations, I really don't recommend changing careers right now. One situation that I do think that is actually better right now than opposed to the last big economic downturn is looking for a job outside of your area. And that's because it's assumed right now you're going to be interviewing virtually. So it doesn't matter if you're down the street from your new employer or in another state. It doesn't matter so much if they're going to move you there or you're going to move there, or maybe that doesn't even matter because they want you to work from home. So yeah, some things like with that have certainly changed. I will talk about how to improve your odds in this part of the presentation, but also talk about that too in part 2. So let's talk a little bit about getting advice. Where should you be getting advice on the job application process and resumes and cover letters? Because I can't cover everything here. So what are some other good places and not so good places to get that advice from? Well, good places. Hiring managers, especially people who hire in your field. They know what people are looking for. People who work in HR, they're professionals. They deal with this all the time. So if you're looking for advice, get advice from someone who works in HR, or get advice from someone who's working at the company you're targeting. And yes, you should be targeting organizations and companies. You shouldn't just be applying to everything, okay? And when I say this here, I don't just mean literally talk to these people, because maybe you do know some people like this and they would be able to offer you advice. But also, when you're doing research on how to better apply for jobs, look for who wrote articles or who wrote the particular resources and see if they've had experience hiring, see if they've worked in HR. Does that make sense? All right, your coworkers and friends, sure, maybe they're great friends, but unless they have experience in HR, they might not be a good person to get advice from. Now, on the other hand, they might be a really good person to do practice interviews with. Likely your friends have been interviewed before, right? Career centers and unemployment offices. Now, I'm not trying to drag these places down. There are an awful lot of good people who work in these places. And they do have a lot of resources, and that might be the best way to utilize a career center and employment office is to utilize the resources that they have. But don't rely on them completely. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen resumes and cover letters come out of career centers and unemployment offices, and the applicant thought everything was perfect. And I take a look at it and I immediately see 5 or 6 spelling errors. Please be the vehicle of your own change. Please take responsibility for your materials. And don't rely completely on an unemployment office or career center to make them perfect. This is your job search. You need to be in control of it. Your parents, sorry, but you know what? They're probably going to give you some really out of date information. Just go down there and talk to someone wasn't a good idea before coronavirus, and it's a really bad idea right now. They really don't want you to come to them, okay? They didn't want you a few years ago to come to them either, or give them phone calls, but right now, please don't listen to your parents, okay? I know they mean well, but they just don't know. Some of the best places to get advice are on HR blogs and career-oriented websites. These 2 HR blogs, Ask a Manager by Allison Green and Evil HR Lady by Suzanne Lucas, are just fantastic. And I can't praise these women highly enough. They're just great. And they have so much great information. This presentation is heavily indebted to both of them. And I highly recommend that you check both of their sites out. If you have a question, chances are someone else has asked it there and they provided feedback for it. They give lots of good examples and tell people what to do and what not to do. All right, so what about that stuff you shouldn't do? Let's talk about that. Functional resumes. This is a big don't. Now, if you don't know what a functional resume is, good. Don't do it. What a functional resume is it's a resume that separates your experience and your work history into separate sections. And I've seen this offered as a suggestion for people who are out of work or have been out of work for some time or returning to the workforce. HR departments hate functional resumes. They hate them because they don't know when you did Excel spreadsheets on a regular basis, because you've listed the Excel spreadsheets as just a key skill. They don't know if your last experience doing an Excel spreadsheet was in 1994. And Excel has changed a little bit since then. So please don't do a functional resume. A lot of times functional resumes will get tossed. They just don't like them. Don't do that. So another thing that you shouldn't do is use an objective. What's an objective? An objective is a phrase that used to be included at the beginning of resumes that basically said what you wanted to do. And they sounded like, my objective is to obtain the position of blah, blah, blah at blah, blah, blah. That's all they were. And they made more sense back in the day when you would be finding jobs in the classified section of a newspaper. Okay, and what you would probably do is send your resume and your cover letter through the mail to someone, and they needed to know what job you're applying for, and the easiest way to do that was to include this objective in the resume. And if you weren't doing it that way, maybe you're even hand delivering it to someone, so it even made sense there. Well, we don't apply for jobs that way anymore, typically. You're usually finding your job through the internet, and you're applying through the website where the job posting is. And because of that, because you're submitting through a link connected to the job posting, they know what job you're applying for. So you don't need to include an objective in your resume anymore. And if you're not doing it that way, you're probably submitting all your materials through an email. And sure, in that email, you'll probably state what job you're applying for, but you don't want to include an objective in your resume there either. Using an objective, it just serves to date your materials. That's all it does today. So please don't use an objective. The other thing you shouldn't include in a resume anymore is references available upon request. It's just not necessary, right? Of course they're available upon request. If a future employer asks you, hey, can we look at your references? And you're like, I don't know if I want you to see my references. The job process is over for you, right? So if they ask for your references, yes, you're going to need to provide them if you want to continue onwards with the job process. So you don't need to include this phrase. It doesn't add anything to your resume. So please don't do either of these things. They only serve to date your resume. Okay, so there are some things that you usually should not include in your application materials, specifically in your resume. And the things that you shouldn't include in your resume are things that are connected to protected classes. Now, I'll talk more about protected classes in part 2 of this job searching class. But the reason why you don't want to include information such as about your race and ethnicity, or whether you're married or have kids, or where you're born, or your age, is because that's connected to those protected classes, and that information cannot be used in the hiring process. So some HR departments actually have policies against accepting resumes that contain this information in them. And this is to protect that company or organization. And they can just say to someone who says, oh, you didn't hire me and you discriminate against me because of my age. And they can say, oh, well, okay, yes, you included that in your resume, but it's our policy to not review resumes that have that information in them. So you do want to be careful about including this type of information in your general application materials and in your resume. So obviously there's some really, really big exceptions here. That demographic survey and application, that information is collected mainly just for demographic purposes, and it's usually listed as being optional. They're just collecting information about you and the other applicants, and they're going to hold that information separate from the hiring process. So yeah, if you want to, you can fill that out. I'm talking about US employment law. I'm not talking about the law in other countries. So sometimes in other countries they may have different requirements, different rules, and sometimes they may require you to do certain things like submit a picture, sometimes even simply for visa purposes, so you can live and work in that country. Sometimes you really, really, really fit a job posting. For example, you're a senior citizen and you want to work at a senior center. You're Jewish and you want to work as an administrative assistant at a synagogue. You're gay and you want to work as a counselor at an LGBTQ plus center. So yeah, if you're comfortable and you want to, it would make sense to share that information. Where would you share that? In your cover letter. Later on, again, if you want to, you could talk about that in an interview. So yes, when you really, really fit, sometimes it certainly could make sense to share that information in some of your application materials. Some fields have different expectations. A good example would be in the acting field. Headshots are generally expected. And they might ask for demographic information too. Some things, languages, for example, are perfectly fine to ask about and to share. There's no reason not to share a language. I realized in the previous slide I talked about you shouldn't share where you're born, because that could reveal that you're born outside the United States, which is actually a protected class. But language, it's a skill. So yes, share the skills that you have. All right, I'm going to use this language is spoken as a bit of a sidebar. I used to work as a librarian at a technical school, and we were very career focused. And while we had a career services department, as a librarian, sometimes I would let students show me their materials for a job application or for a resume. And so it wasn't out of the ordinary for someone to do that. So a woman came into the library one day and she asked me to look over her resume. And I was looking over her resume and something jumped out at me as a bit odd. And so I looked up at her and I said, I know you know this, but Filipino really isn't a real language. And now, before you write me letters, I know that Filipino is the standardized variety of Tagalog, but it wasn't spelled the correct way on the resume either, which is also kind of a giveaway that something was a little off here. And when I said this to her, she just busted up laughing. And it turned out that's why she wanted me to look at her resume. And she told me that someone in the career services department had told her, instead of putting down the language that she actually spoke from the Philippines, she should put down Filipino. And I was like, wow, that's weird. And she's like, yeah, that is weird. And I said, well, what language do you actually speak from the Philippines? Because I've been to the Philippines and I know there are a lot of different languages there. And she said, well, she spoke Visayan and she didn't speak Tagalog at all, which would mean that putting Filipino down was also misleading. And so we kind of agreed that this was really weird and that I didn't like that advice she was given and she didn't like that advice that she was given either. And we talked about it a bit more and we kind of figured that maybe the career services department was in their way trying to protect her in a really misguided way, and that perhaps they thought that she could be discriminated against by putting down a language that someone might not know. But too long didn't listen or read. She decided that she was okay with that. She wanted to put down the language that she actually spoke because it would be misleading not to, but also she didn't want to work for a prospective employer that might discriminate against her for speaking a language like Visayan. She didn't want that. And she was going into a medical field, and we thought that that was certainly an asset. So in a way here, this is about a don't. Don't rely too much, again, on career services departments and the advice of others sometimes, but also do trust your gut and do what feels right. And if something doesn't feel right, ask someone else for their point of view too. A few more things that I don't want you to do. Special resume paper, I know they make it. I know you can find it in stores. I know this package says resume. I know it says ideal for resume. They lie. Don't buy it, don't use it. Just use regular paper. If you use special resume paper, it's going to look like you're applying for a job in 1992. FYI, the career services department at the school I last worked for, the one that told the woman to use a language that she didn't speak, they were constantly handing this stuff out. I don't understand why. Templates. Please don't use a resume template. Yes, you can find them on Microsoft Word. HR departments, a lot of them don't care for them and they can spot them a mile away. So please don't use templates. Yeah, you can get some ideas sometimes from templates, but there's a lot of resume don'ts in templates too. Yeah, just say no, please. Don't cold call employers. They really don't like people doing that. Just calling them up and saying, hey, do you have any jobs open? That's annoying. You can find that out on their website, to be perfectly honest. Don't do anything to avoid the application process or the hiring process. That process is there for a reason and you should follow it. So this would include finding the hiring manager, hunting them down either at work or outside of work. It could include delivering your resume in person. Those two things, especially right now during a pandemic, big no. Submitting a video or a PowerPoint resume when they haven't asked for that. I get it. I've seen articles saying, hey, why don't you try a PowerPoint resume? If you actually look at who wrote those articles online, you'll see that those people are not HR professionals. It's just an idea that they've come up with. Don't submit materials that haven't been asked for. And I can guarantee you it's highly unlikely they would ask you for a video or PowerPoint resume as opposed to a regular resume, right? And how would you submit that through the online portal, especially a video? Anyway, that's just weird to me. Informational interviews, if you are lucky enough to find someone who wants to grant you an informational interview, just keep it as an informational interview. Don't try to turn it around at the end by asking if they have any positions open or things like that. That just becomes weird really quickly. If they start talking about it, that's a different ball game, but you should be the one who does that. Also, trying to speed up the application process by calling them or emailing them a few days after you submit the application. That's just annoying. You don't need to ask anything at that point. You don't need to ask them if they got it or what the timeline is. Just let things sit. Like I said, move on after you submit your application. Don't dwell. I know I've said this before. Please don't apply it to as many jobs as possible. That's just going to shoot you in your foot. And finally, don't lie about your skills, abilities, education. That's also going to shoot you in the foot. They will find out. In a way, the Career Services Department was encouraging that woman to lie about a language that she spoke. And if like I could pick up that something was a little off with it, a prospective employer might as well. And that would not have been good for her. So gimmicks, please don't do gimmicks. I know you'll find articles that pop up from time to time talking about how some guy got a job because he went and put his resume on a candy wrapper. Those articles are just clickbait, by the way, and usually those people work in marketing. I'm not saying it never works, but it usually isn't going to work, and I don't want you to waste your time and money. Here we have some examples. We have an intern set. Leah was giving this out to places that she wanted to intern at. No, don't do that. We also have what I believe is a carrier pigeon with a resume attached to the carrier pigeon's foot. This is cute, but this stuff gets creepy really, really quickly. It gets odd, right? I mean, is this person applying to work at a carrier pigeon facility? I doubt it. I really doubt it. And then, there are things like billboards. I understand. All this stuff is out of it's out of desperation. And Pasha, she did this during the last Great Recession, and she spent about $7,000 on this billboard. You don't need to do that. You really don't. And I don't know if this actually got her a job or not, but you don't need to spend that much money. But ultimately, I think all of these things, that they cheapen your brand, and you don't want that. So in wrapping this section up, there may be exceptions to some of the things that I've said. And I've alluded to that, such as like in acting, a headshot is expected, and that's fine to provide that. You have to know your field and what's appropriate for your field. The thing is, what I really want you to focus on is follow instructions and what's common in your field. And if they don't ask for something, don't provide it. Yes, you do want to stand out, but you want to stand out for being a great candidate, not because you did something outside of the norm. Okay, so what are some other things that you might want to do before you begin your job search? So one of those really great things that you can do is to brainstorm your KSAs, your knowledge, skills, and abilities. And as I previously said, these are things that you can show an employer that you know how to do, maybe through having a diploma or certificate, or maybe it's a skill like knowing a language or a computer program. One really great way to brainstorm is by doing a word web. I know, you did that back in school. But sit down and actually do it again. It really can help to show you what your strengths are, but it can also show you what some of your weaknesses might be. For example, this person knows a little bit about Excel, but they feel that they're a beginner. Now might be the time to actually go and become better than a beginner at Excel, right? Some other things that you might notice, though, is well, here, this person, they have a bachelor's degree in Spanish. And if you look a little bit closer, though, the type of Spanish that they speak is actually the Spanish that's spoken in Spain. So that might not be something to highlight unless you're applying for a job that focuses on working with the country of Spain, for example. And you might also be able to pull out some really specific things that you might want to highlight. Like, for example, this manager increased sales 26%. That should be something that goes in your resume. And that's what you can use your Word Web for, is to help build your resume and to pull the things that you want to highlight in an interview. And if you haven't already done so, write down your achievements. Think about the things that you have done. Obviously, it's easier if you've been doing that all along, but it is helpful to think about what are the things that you have done. Creating a brief job history for yourself, that's a good idea. And if you haven't already, think about the documents you might need. Some jobs, for example, in the field of education, often require a diploma or a transcript, and it's easier to go and request those things in advance rather than telling a prospective employer, oh, I don't have my transcripts, I have to go request them, and then 2-3 weeks later you have them. So get everything ready. This is also a good time to talk to prospective references. Make sure you have up-to-date contact information and ask if they would be a good reference for you. I would hope that people would be honest here. Remember, a good reference is usually someone who supervised you, like a former boss. Sometimes you can use a coworker who knows a lot about the job that you did, but please don't include anyone that you're related to, a spouse or a significant other. So one thing, if you're in a more professionally oriented field, you might want to think about getting a LinkedIn profile. Basically, LinkedIn is like Facebook for professionals. And I can tell you from personal experience, I have gotten notifications from LinkedIn that prospective employers have looked at my profile during the application process. And you want to make sure too that your profile is visible to everyone during the job search. So here's a slightly edited version of my profile from a few years ago. You can generally see how many people have looked at your profile. You can use LinkedIn to connect and keep in touch with other people and network. So you build out your LinkedIn profile just like you would a resume. You go backwards in time just like you would a resume, and you show your duties and responsibilities. I don't want you to be too worried about the resume and LinkedIn profile matching up exactly. No matchy-matchy. You don't have to worry about that. They shouldn't be dramatically different, but it's not uncommon for there to be a lot more in-depth information on a LinkedIn profile than a resume. You can't include everything on a resume, and you're targeting that resume at a particular job that you're applying for. A LinkedIn profile isn't targeted at one particular job that you're applying for, right? It's not. So HR professionals, hiring managers, they understand all that. And even sometimes, to be honest, I've had job titles on a resume that were a little bit different than what I had on the LinkedIn profile, just because I was trying to communicate something in particular to the employer I was applying for. It shouldn't be dramatically different, okay? But yeah, they don't need to match completely. Don't get too excited if someone does look at your profile. It really just means that someone looked at your profile. One time I did have a prospective employer look at my profile, and the funny thing is I did get a little bit excited, and then a few months later I checked, and the person who looked at my job profile, she'd been promoted into the position. All right, so let's talk about job applications. So let your network know you're looking for a job. Now, obviously, you might want to be a little selective if you don't want your current employer to know. But letting your network know, that's a very effective means of finding a new job, because maybe someone could actually put in a good word for you during the hiring process, because maybe they work for that company, or maybe they know someone who works for that company. So letting your network know, really good idea. Social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, a lot of times the companies will let their social media sites share that information that they're looking for a particular position. Also look on websites related to your field or other professional publications, even mailing lists, email lists. Sometimes jobs are promoted there. Working with a recruiter might be an option depending on the field that you're in. A lot of times the recruiter will come to you, but yeah, recruiters can help you find work. So if it's been a while since you've applied for a job, Monster.com and Career Builder aren't as popular as they used to be. And I feel like even back in the day, posting a resume, which is what they highly encourage you to do, didn't work so well. And the idea was you'd post it and someone would find it and you'd be offered a job. And the reality was you still had to apply through the links in their site, and typically you'd be taken to the company website anyway to apply. A much more popular site today, and I highly recommend that you use this site, is Indeed.com. They are a website aggregator, which means they pull jobs from all over the internet. And they've been the most popular job searching site for about a decade now. One tip with Indeed.com is to continue looking at those companies and organizations you're targeting, because jobs will show up there first, and often they can take some time to show up on Indeed.com. And if you do find the job on Indeed.com, check the actual posting date, because sometimes those jobs on Indeed can be a few weeks old. So FYI. There are other sites, obviously. Craigslist, I found a job on Craigslist once. EDD and employment agencies. There are lots of places that can help with the job search and have job postings. One site I'm not going to recommend that you use is the ladders.com. You can do more research if you so desire, but there have been allegations made against the ladders.com and lawsuits filed against them. So, as I've been saying to you throughout this, please don't overlook company or organization websites. You should be targeting companies and organizations, so yes, do look at them. But also colleges and universities. They do hire a wide variety of people. They don't just hire professors. There are people in the administration, there are groundskeepers, there are HVAC personnel, people who work in the cafeteria, administrative assistants. So colleges and universities have a wide variety of jobs too. And so do government websites, especially city, state, and county. And typically those jobs they pay well, have great benefits, and they can lead to a long and lasting career. Federal positions are a bit of a different animal than any other type of job I've talked about here today. And federal positions, you can find those on usajobs.gov. I am not going to go into detail about how to apply for federal jobs, because how you do that is very, 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 very different from every other type of job. For example, most resumes should be 2 pages long. But a government job, it could be 4 pages, 5 pages, 6 pages long, because you're matching everything in your resume to various required points that are listed in the job posting. So it's not uncommon to have a super long resume for a federal position. So if you're interested in federal positions, there are resources out there about them, and we here at the library can help you find those. All right, so let's look at a job posting. So you found this job posting and it looks interesting. The first thing I would do, and I don't actually have this listed here, but I would check the posting date. make sure that this is a recent job posting. Because if it's a month old and there's no closing date on it, you probably should just move on. You really just should. But if there's a closing date and it is a month old and the closing date hasn't passed, then okay, consider it. Consider it. If it fits for you, then might as well go ahead and apply. So a good habit to get into is to print off the job description before you actually apply for the job, and make a file on each company and position that you're submitting. Okay, that's just a good idea, because job descriptions can and do disappear, and you don't want to be in a situation where 3 or 4 months from now you get a call or an email from a prospective employer and you can't remember what the job is about. And you don't really want to ask them about that. You know, it's much easier to just look in a file and look at the job description, right? Because you print it out and you were prepared. So that's something that you want to really, really do. Another thing that was helpful for me is I kept track of all my applications in a spreadsheet, so I could see where I applied to the same company more than once, but it also helped me to make sure I didn't accidentally double apply for the same job, because sometimes, you know, those jobs, you're like, did I apply for it or not? If you keep track of it, you can check. And I also could keep track on the results too. I could actually look and see, hey, I got an interview for this job application. I was offered a job for this job application after I was interviewed. So that's helpful. And if you notice nothing's happening, maybe you do need to adjust what you're doing. It also helped me feel like I was moving towards a goal. And it felt so good at the end when I could actually put down that I had been offered a job and that I chose to accept it. So what if you don't meet all the requirements? Well, that's a judgment call. And in this type of job market where it's an employer's job market, you could be wasting your time, because the successful candidate is likely to meet or exceed the requirements in the job posting. That's just reality. So if you're not close to completing the education or the certifications asked for, it's probably a good idea to just move on. It really is. Okay? Usually those things are kind of set in stone. If you're a month or 2 away, you might be able to get away with it. But if you keep also noticing the same requirements for education certification and you don't have those, well, maybe it's time to go and get those things. Think about that. Now, there's some areas where it really, really is a judgment call, and you'll want to think about, is this worth my time? For example, experience. If the job posting is asking for 5 years of experience and you've only got 4, that's probably close enough. There isn't a big difference between someone with 4 years of experience and 5 years. There just isn't. And if they're asking for example, fluency in one language and you speak a different language, you know, maybe that's good enough for them. It's hard to say. It still might not be successful, but you know what? Sometimes it's worth a shot. Follow whatever instructions are given, too. They really mean those instructions. I mean, if you can't follow instructions during the hiring process, can you be expected to follow instructions if they were to hire you? Think about that for a moment. Like, you're telling them you don't want to follow instructions. So, for whatever reason, a lot of resumes and applications don't make it through to being offered an interview. And one of those reasons is you just don't meet the requirements. And in a market like this, you know, it probably won't work out for you to getting an interview. And so it really is important that you budget your time. Think about the jobs that you're applying for. Think about them carefully. Does this make sense for me? You know, if it's not the next most logical step in your career, it's like a leap, you probably just should skip it. So the purpose of a resume is not actually to get you the job. That rarely happens. Unless you're Al Gore, you're not going to get a job based on your resume alone. Your resume is supposed to help you get an interview. So that's the goal of a good resume, is to get you an interview and to see an actual person. So if you're starting from scratch with a resume, there are just so many different formats to choose from, and I think it's best to kind of get an idea of what's out there and what people are doing. One way you can do that is just Google the word resume and see what's there and see what you like and what you don't like. But also remember to use judgment and what I've been telling you in this workshop. Another thing you can do is check out recent, emphasis on recent resume books. We can put you in touch with those items by calling the library at 760-322-7323. And a lot of times those books actually have resumes targeted for the particular field that you might be applying for, or a similar field. And they're usually written by professionals who have experience writing resumes. Again, I'll stress, please don't use templates, so that could be from Microsoft Word or by another program like Canva. I've noticed that some of the things in like a source like Canva, or even some of the ones if you just Google, they'll have things like photographs and such in them, and that's really, as I've said before, not advisable. Now, whatever resume that you create, you can reuse it. You can use it over and over again, but remember, you're going to alter it. Whatever resume you create is just a base for the other resumes, and you can always add and subtract, and sometimes you might need to do that, take out some experience or add some in, depending on the job that you're applying for. And the same goes for cover letters, of course. When writing a resume, I do want you to consider using a summary instead of an objective. Remember, we don't use objectives anymore. So a summary is a much more modern version of an objective. Well, okay, it's not an objective, but it takes the place of an objective. And a summary is short, it's brief, it just says who you are. Okay, so here we have certified medical assistant with 6 years of experience in immediate care and an additional 2 years of experience at Tyco ZGS Recovery Center, focused on providing exceptional customer care and service in a fast-paced environment to all ages. Well, doesn't that sound impressive? So it's just a way for people to get an idea of who you are, professionally speaking. So there are some things that I'd like you to consider when writing a resume, and I'll give you an example of a good resume in just a bit, but some of those things that I want you to really strongly consider are using bullet points. They help people to read your resume better, and they help to set information off. You might want to include a section just for skills and abilities, typically closer to the top of your resume, above your experience. You also ought to use common labels such as summary, education, and experience. This is important, and I'll talk more about why it's important in just a bit, but it has to do with how applicant tracking systems, these are the websites that you're submitting your application materials through, read your resume. Using 2 pages for a resume, that's the cap for an experienced candidate. If you're a recent graduate, you can get away with 1 page, but you should not generally go over 2 pages, unless it's a federal government job, right? Those are different. Another thing to consider is excluding skills and abilities that aren't relevant to the job that you're applying for. Just take them off your resume. For example, if you're applying to work in a restaurant, maybe as part of the wait staff, if it isn't asked for you to have knowledge of Excel, maybe you leave that off your resume. Does that make sense? Or if you're applying to work at Ben & Jerry's and you just came from Cold Stone Creamery, sure, there's stuff that could switch over, like customer service and the cash register and maybe working with ice cream, but that stuff that you do on the cold slab at Cold Stone where you mix up the ingredients and make the ice cream basically for the customer right then and there, that's not going to transfer over to Ben & Jerry's. So keep stuff that's not relevant, take that off the resume. And also stuff that's old and out of date. For example, WordPerfect is not a very common application anymore, so it doesn't belong on your resume. Now, I'm not saying to misrepresent yourself, but even sometimes education or certifications should be left off too. If you're applying for a job that doesn't require the ability to work a forklift, then don't include that you can work a forklift on your resume. So your email address. You might want to have a separate email address for your job search. You can get free email accounts from Gmail. And Gmail is a good modern email address. You know what? I have to confess, I have a Hotmail account. Don't judge me, but I feel like it's a badge of honor. But I don't use that. I wouldn't use that if I was applying for a job. I just have attached an Outlook.com profile to that same email address. And look at your email address too. Make sure it's professional. It's great if you're Susie's mommy, but that's probably not something you want to reveal in the job searching process. And be sure that you don't have any drug references, alcohol references, sex references. You would be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't, what I have seen. I have seen everything. And also make sure your email account is set up in a professional way. No crazy colors, no background images. At one time, sat down next to a guy who wanted me to read his email that he was sending to prospective employer, and I had to tell him to take off the pandas dancing in the field in the background of the email. Just don't do that. Also, please check that your voicemail is set up, can accept messages, and is professional. I one time called someone, and you know what? His voicemail was a long message directed at his ex, and I was not pleased with what I heard him say in that. Also, when you do save your resume and your cover letter, make sure you have some sort of naming structure. Look at the example I have here. Especially if you're submitting the resume and cover letter through an email, but really in any situation, make sure you do this, because what if somebody has to download your resume or save it in a file location, and you have like resume 5 as the name of the title, and they have to put your name in it, or it just creates extra work for someone else, and why would you do that? When you are writing a resume, in most fields your education should go at the bottom. Exceptions, you're a recent graduate, or you're applying in a field that highly values education. I'm a librarian. You know what? Librarians, we value education, so typically that should go probably at the top. If you have higher education, you don't need to include a GED or high school diploma. You don't need to include those things. It's understood that you have those things. And your work experience should be going from the present and working backwards in time. Keep in mind that if your resume and application materials make it through the applicant tracking system, which we'll be talking about much more in depth in just a few moments, and they make it into the hands of an actual person, the decision whether to call you in for an interview or not is going to be made very quickly. They're going to look at your resume for a minute or so, not much more than that. And so it's very important to make sure that everything's very clear and concise, to the point that you have it set up in a way that's easy to read with lots of white space. And please, no errors, no spelling errors. This is one of those cases where it's best to proofread it again and again and again, have someone else look at it too. So, as we said, the goal of a resume is to get you an interview. That's all the resume is supposed to do. And a way to meet that goal is to show that you meet the requirements of the job posting, to show this prospective employer that you're a good fit, that you could quite possibly be what they are looking for. And how do you do that? Well, look at the requirements in the job posting and make sure that you show in your resume that you meet those requirements, but not just say that you meet the requirement, actually show them how you meet the requirement. by giving details or maybe giving a statistic. For example, this job posting, the requirement was experience with zero gravity sickness. Now, doesn't that sound super scary? Oh. But the right way to actually show that you meet this requirement is to say something like, assisted in treating those with zero gravity sickness by taking vitals and administering prescribed treatments, created zero gravity sickness treatment checklist for staff which reduced recovery time by 27%. Now, doesn't that sound impressive? The wrong way to do that is just say, oh, yeah, I help people with zero gravity sickness. Yeah, so you need to give a bit more information, show how you meet the requirement in your resume. So here is a resume, and if I was doing this class in person, I would actually ask the class, what do you think about this resume? And usually that question is met with awkward silence because they think that I'm presenting a resume to them that they should emulate. Actually, this is just an example of what a lot of people submit when they apply for jobs. Maybe it's not this bad, but there are an awful lot of bad resumes being submitted to job postings out there. And so my point is that if you can submit a resume that's clean looking and is well organized and is error free, you're already ahead of the game. And to be perfectly honest, we'll look at this a little bit more in detail in just a moment, but this is a resume that's likely going to get tossed. So what exactly is wrong with this? Well, we start off with some hyperlinks. I hate seeing hyperlinks in resumes and cover letters, and the way that you get rid of them is just to hit backspace at the end of the email address. Also, if you look at this, yes, there's a lot of white space here, but the sections do run into each other, and it's hard to tell where one section begins and where it ends. We have some questionable skills listed here, like English and French. If you are not completely fluent in French, you either need to say so or don't put it down at all, because you could walk into an interview and someone starts to interview in French. Think about that. It's happened to people. Phone calls, basic computer skills, email, MS Word, these things are not things you'd really want to just list as a skill. Like, seriously, you know how to answer a phone call? And urology, phlebotomy, those are fields. You are an expert at the entire field of urology, the entire field of phlebotomy. Be careful. Seriously. And mind you, I have seen these things listed on resumes before. I've seen people do this. This is why I'm saying this. There are lots of spelling errors here. The experience is also in the wrong order, and job titles are missing, so there's a lot of stuff wrong here. Also, a 2.2 GPA. That GPA is not good, and I'm sorry to say, you know what, it just needs to go. If your GPA is 4.0, put it down, especially if you're a recent graduate. But you know what, if you're not a recent graduate, no one cares what your GPA was 10 years ago. No one cares. And then there are all these other formatting issues. This doesn't look very good either. It looks like you don't know how to use Microsoft Word, and you are claiming that you do know how to use Microsoft Word. Something to think about. So this resume is clearly a lot better than the one I showed you previously. Now, I'm not saying that this is perfect though. One area that could be improved upon is we could use more white space. More white space helps the reader see the information that you want to set off better. The reality is the average person who looks at your resume, if they actually look at your resume, is they're going to glance at your resume, they're going to scan it, they're going to look at it for 7 to 8 seconds, maybe max a minute, but no one's going to spend 20 minutes looking over and hunting for information inside your resume. oh, there it is on line 37. I found that they have this certification. No, they're not going to look at it that way. So you need to make sure it's easy to read and there's a lot of white space so they can just scan it and find the information that they want. Now, the thing is, I didn't quite do that here because there are a lot of things I wanted to show you that you should be putting in a resume, and it was just easier for me to put them all on one page. So what did we do here to make this better? Well, we used the header, and that's acceptable to use in a resume. And also notice that I didn't label what the email was or the phone or the address. It's understood, right, that that's what those things are. You can also see that I set off that the fact that this is a certified medical assistant and that they have over 8 years of experience. And that makes that information just pop out. And I actually did the same thing by putting the certifications separate too and by labeling them. This helps an individual reading this resume to see right away, oh, this is someone who could be our candidate. This is someone who meets all of the basic requirements. That summary, sure, I could label it. Also notice, because we use bullets, the certifications and skills are easy to read. They're also not vague. Okay, maybe this person is really fluent in French and English, because I would assume the moon colony has many different languages spoken there. And those bullets do set everything off, so we have consistent formatting. And if you were to also look at the job posting, you would see that I used words or vocabulary from that job posting in the resume. And those keywords that I pulled from that job posting help the applicant tracking system. Remember, we're going to probably be submitting this resume through an applicant tracking system, a website that accepts applications. And it's important for the applicant tracking system to see those keywords because it helps the applicant tracking system determine that you're a good candidate. Of course, there are some things that could be improved. If I were to have done this on 2 pages, I would have spread out the information a bit more, included more white space. And you know what? Since I currently have this job, I could have made that in the present tense. And also, I put the education at the bottom, and I did take off that 2.2 GPA. I don't know, maybe this person had a lot of really good extracurriculars. Hopefully. So a cover letter's purpose is similar to that of a resume. It's to help you get an interview. And it shows why you're interested in the job and why you do well in the position. And back in the day, what would happen is people would read your cover letter and they'd be so excited about your cover letter, at least the idea was they'd be so excited about your cover letter, that they'd look at your resume and then call you for an interview. So if you can submit a cover letter, you should submit a cover letter. You definitely should do that. A lot of people won't do that. And in a cover letter, you can show why you're passionate about the position. You can show why you'd be a great fit. But in addition to all that, you can do some things that wouldn't work in a resume. Like you can be professional, but a bit conversational. You can inject some personality into your application with your cover letter. So this is important. You can make yourself seem like a real human being, which you are, right? And you can also talk about some things that don't fit well into a resume, such as explain a gap in your employment history, or that you're moving to the area, you're returning to the workforce, changing careers, or hey, you've got 15 years of experience, but the job posting only requires 3. Why would you be a really good fit for that position? That's something you probably want to address. Let's look at a cover letter. Now, I'm not saying that this is a perfect cover letter. It is a bit too long, but my reasoning in making it a bit longer than I normally would is simply because I want to cover a lot of things here. So, yeah, there probably should be a bit more white space on this. Probably 3 paragraphs is enough. But let's look at some of the things that make this a good cover letter. And the thing is that the cover letter shouldn't regurgitate what's on the resume. It shouldn't just repeat the information from there. Should you reference stuff in your resume? Sure, yes, you should do that. But the cover letter focuses on saying why the candidate is a good candidate for the job. And it sounds like a real person. It's 1 page long. Yes, it should be a bit shorter. Like I said, probably 3 paragraphs is enough. But there also aren't any grammatical errors, too. All right, so let's take a closer look at the cover letter. Now, what you'll notice here is that it is in a typical business letter format, and if you don't know what that is, you can go Google that and find that information out. We did start with Dear Hiring Manager. It's okay to start the letter with Dear Hiring Manager or Dear Selection Committee. Don't use Dear Sir or Madam. That's a bit out of date now. You don't want to sound out of date, right? You also don't need to worry about finding the name of the hiring manager. I've heard people say that you have to put that down, and if you don't know that information, as in it's not listed in the job posting, you need to go contact the company. Don't do that. It's really not that important, and the reality is a lot of people might be looking at this letter, so making it a bit generic is okay there. Notice we don't say where we found the job posting anymore. That's not important. Back in the day, it was helpful when they were putting the job posting in classified ads, and maybe it was in multiple newspapers, and they needed to know that information. But likely right now you're getting the job posting through the company's website. And they'll know where you applied for it, right? You do want to mention the job title and what organization it's connected to, and double check if you're reusing the cover letter. Remember, you should always tailor your materials to the job that you're applying for, so it won't ever be the same cover letter. But you always do want to double check that you've matched the position title and the organization you're applying to with what's in your cover letter, right? If you're applying for a job at Macy's and you leave Sears there, you're probably not getting called in for an interview. At some point, you do want to reference your resume, make mention of it. Keywords are important to use in the cover letter, just like in a resume, and literally just look at the job posting and choose some words to include in your cover letter. That's all you need to do. Don't try to cover everything, though. You do want to make it clear why you want to work for this organization, and if you don't know that, now is the time to do some research on the company to figure that out. And if you have a relationship with them, such as you volunteered with them or you've worked with them before, make mention of that. That's important. And at the end, you wrap everything up and leave the ball in their court. Let them decide if they want to contact you. Now is not the time for a hard sell. And I've seen cover letter examples which suggest that you should say, I will call you next Wednesday. Don't do that. That's a bit too much. Let them contact you. All right, now I realize that most job applications you'll be applying through a website. I'm going to start talking about that in just a moment here. But the reality is you still could be emailing your resume and cover letter to someone, or maybe it's a Craigslist posting and you have to do the same thing. You should save your materials, like your resume and cover letter, as a PDF because that locks in your formatting. Remember that, okay? I can't tell you how many times I've gotten Word resumes or cover letters, and the thing is I open up on my computer and I've got some different settings and the formatting is all messed up. So don't do that. Make sure you save your resume and cover letter as a PDF. All right, let's talk about those websites you'll be submitting resumes and cover letters to. Those websites, they have an official sounding name. That official sounding name is Applicant Tracking System, also known as an ATS. Doesn't that sound exciting? Yeah, so you're usually going to be submitting your resume and cover letter to an ATS. And most of these applicant tracking system programs require you to build an online resume. They require you to upload your resume and your cover letter too. And they usually want you to cut and paste a resume and your cover letter into a box, but not always. What I do recommend with these lovely applicant tracking systems, do you detect the sarcasm in my voice here? Do you? I recommend that after you set up an account, please go through all the steps of the application. Stop before submitting. Don't submit now. You haven't put anything in there. Just go through it and see everything that's there. Okay? And note the closing date. Usually these systems have closing dates. Okay? And they mean that closing date. And if you can get your application in before the closing date, that usually means you'll at least get a review for an interview. If you submit it afterwards, maybe not. But look at everything that's there and make note of any questions or requirements. All right? Those questions are important and you want to spend time on those questions. And the last thing you want to have happen is you thought the deadline was midnight on Friday, and at 11:50 you've got everything ready and you've got everything uploaded, and then you find there are 5 questions and you've got 8 minutes to finish them. So prepare those questions in advance. And make special note of any special instructions or directions. The file formats, pay special attention to those. So there are some things about applicant tracking systems that I want you to understand. One of those things is please fill out everything. Oftentimes applications with blank sections can get eliminated. So if you don't have an answer, put down not applicable or no answer. Also, please don't say see resume either. They want you to fill out those boxes. I understand your work experience. Those fields are very similar to your resume, but they really do want you to fill those out. Also, you could get eliminated by answering questions truthfully. And yes, you should be truthful. You always should tell the truth. But there's a bit of a gray area around these questions. Like, for example, do you have 5 years of experience in management? Well, what if you've got 4.5 years? Is that close enough? The reality is, if you say no, your application is done. There's no reason to continue onwards. You've been eliminated. You really have. If you put yes, you're still in the pool. All right? So if you're close enough, I would recommend saying yes. But you will want to think about, is this application really worth my time? Am I likely to be seen as qualified by the applicant tracking system and someone in HR? Because if your application does make it through the ATS, and it might not, but if it does, at some point an individual is going to look at your materials. And they'll have to make a judgment call too. They might say, well, you know what, 4.5 years, that is pretty close. I'm okay with that. And they might decide to call you for an interview, or they might not. So the worst case scenario is you don't get called in for an interview if you're close enough. But don't stretch too far. If you've only got a year of experience, that's not close enough, right? And some things aren't meant to be exact either. Like if you are asked, do you have a master's in business administration, and you have a master's in business, just put yes. That's close enough. Okay, don't take that question too literally. But the thing is, do be careful with these questions because they can eliminate you from the applicant pool. So if you haven't figured this out already, the applicant tracking system is scoring your application. And it's going to kick some people out. And some people get sent on to an actual person to review their materials. How do you help yourself get into that pool of people who will be reviewed by real people? Well, you need to use traditional headings like summary or experience. That helps. Also using keywords. Keywords are really helpful here too. Also, be careful with uploading your resume to the applicant tracking system, especially if you're allowing the applicant tracking system to pull your information from an uploaded resume. if you're going to allow that, and some of them do this, be careful because special characters can get rendered strangely that way. So you might want to put it in your resume as a text document. There are some other problems with the applicant tracking systems. There's a lot of redundancy. You will be doing the same thing over and over and over again with every job you apply for. Very rarely does one company organization use the same ATS. And if you do find that, like yay, usually you can transfer information over from a previous application. A big problem with ATS, though, is that they can eliminate qualified candidates and pass on unqualified ones to the HR department. They do that all the time. But the thing is, HR departments are okay with that because they still get enough candidates. So it's your job to make sure your application gets through the ATS. That is a stumbling block for some people, but another way of looking at it is if you're successful here, maybe you would be successful at the job. And if you're not successful here, well, maybe you wouldn't be successful at the job. So yeah, they do this because there's just way too many applications for HR to sort through. So too long didn't read. You need to make sure the ATS thinks you're qualified first. That's the first step. That's the first hurdle you got to get through. Then, if you get through that, a real person will look at your materials, and hopefully that person in HR will then decide, well, to call you in for an interview. Now, a text version of your resume, which I talked about earlier, typically made in Notepad, is handy. Now, what you can do with the text version of your resume is you can copy and paste from it and use that to fill out the many fields, for example, in your work history. Now, I realize you could also type out the information, but we're human. Typing all the information out, it could result in errors, and there's typically no spell check in an applicant tracking system. And if you copy and paste from a Word document, you'll notice that the formatting is often getting messed up and you have to reformat things. So using a text document to copy and paste from can really, really help. And this is an example of what I'm talking about, and I'll talk a little bit more about how you would do this. But basically, you would just copy the information into the required fields. And you could use spell check in Word. Okay, you'd make this document, this resume, probably in Word first, and do your spell check there, and then reformat it when you paste it into the text document, which is Notepad. See, it's quite easy this way. So here is a blown up example of that resume in text format. Now, as I alluded to, I made this originally in Microsoft Word, and I'd run spell check and all that fun stuff in Microsoft Word first. And then I would clean up the formatting. So most of the time, you'll just be copying and pasting from this into the work experience fields. But sometimes they may require you to paste an entire resume and or cover letter into a field, and you can use this text format for that as well. Remember, everything needs to be tailored for the job you're applying for, so double check you're not copying information from a previous job you've applied for. So looking at this a little bit closer, look at how it's formatted. Everything has been made flush to the left. I got rid of the symbols, and again, as in all the materials, I tried to use as many keywords as I possibly could. Do be careful though. I noticed that after I made this, I left a comma. I don't think this error would be easily spotted, but do proof carefully. So the purpose of the text resume, again, really is just to help you copy and paste into the fields in an ATS. And also, sometimes some ATS systems do require you to paste your entire resume into a field, and they sometimes require the cover letter to be pasted into a field as well. You're not required to do this, but trust me, it does help. It does help to save your sanity. So after you've submitted your application, I'll let you have a few minutes and you can just ponder how your life would change if you were offered this job. But don't spend too much time doing that. Move on mentally. Please keep searching. Keep a schedule with your applications, a few per week. And don't stop and dwell on this posting. A lot of things could happen. It could get canceled. It could get delayed, especially during times like this. There's so much that could happen. And if you're doing this right, one day you get a phone call or an email requesting an interview. And yay, you've gotten over the first hurdle. And when this happens, you also know that your application, your cover letter, your resume are working, because what's the purpose of all these things? They are to get you an interview. So if you've been applying for months and months and months and you haven't gotten any callbacks or emails about your application materials, yeah, probably something's wrong with your application or your cover letter or your resume. Or you could just be applying for positions you're unqualified for, and you want to consider that as well. Sometimes what's wrong with your application materials could be something really simple. I remember reading about a woman one time who was in the nursing field, and she misspelled shift nurse. Once you fixed that, it was smooth sailing ahead. But the issues might be a bit deeper than what I'm talking about here. So what you might want to do is actually have someone with experience in hiring or HR or a really good friend who's detail oriented give your materials an overview and give you some straightforward feedback. The thing is, I know it might be hard to hear this, but it's good for you to realize that what you're doing isn't working. That way you can course correct and fix it. All right, so that concludes our first part of our job searching class. Now, I do want to remind you that we will be having part 2 in January of next year. So on January 7th, we will put part 2, which will focus on interviews on YouTube, and you can watch it on demand. And we'll also be putting it up live on Facebook at 2 p.m., January 7th, 2021. So there are many great resources available to you. You can find one on our library's website. You can find Job Now under e-learning and research, and they offer free job coaches and resume review. If they tell you to do a functional resume though, what do you say? Say thank you and walk away slowly. Okay, back away from your computer screen, and just don't do that, please. Okay, all right. Also, don't overlook askamanager.org. That's Allison Green, or Evil HR Lady, Suzanne Lucas. I am given to understand they're friends, but I also know that they are wonderful and they give great advice. They are HR professionals who know what they're talking about. You can look at other resources at our library at our website, palmspringslibrary.org, and you can get assistance from our librarians at 760-322-7323, and we can put you in touch with actual books about resumes and cover letters and other materials. If you do have questions specifically for me, the best way to get a hold of me is to send me an email, and I will get in touch with you as soon as I can. One more thing. Don't give up. Don't surrender to this. You have no idea how close you could possibly be to landing a new job. It might seem like nothing's going on right now, and then suddenly next week you get a few phone calls, and suddenly you've got 2 or 3 interviews scheduled. Sometimes this is just how this all works. So please don't give up. Please keep plugging away. If you continue to work at this, it will happen for you. If you don't believe that right now, you know what? I believe it for you. All right? All right, best of luck to you. Hope to see you next time, January 7th, for part 2, interviews.